Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 16 May 2024 edition of the Continental Commandery's Maritime History Virtual Lecture Series. I'm Captain Fred Passman, Commander General-elect of the Naval Order of the United States and immediate past commander of the Continental Commandery, and welcome everybody aboard. Since we started recording back in May of 2020, we've now recorded more than 30 programs, which you can watch by going to the Commandery's website and looking at either past events, or if you go into the past events page, if you click on our YouTube channel, they're split between YouTube and live events, and you'll find the entire library there. Before introducing this evening's speaker, I want to again say a few words about the Naval Order of the United States. The Naval Order is our nation's oldest ancestral organization dedicated to maritime history. Our mission is to preserve, promote, and celebrate U.S. maritime history and camaraderie amongst our companions. Anyone who has served in any of our maritime services or is a direct descendant of one of those veterans is eligible to join the Naval Order. And to find out more about that, go to the Naval Order website and click on How to Join NOUS. Today's presentation is being recorded on YouTube and will be available for viewing immediately after the program ends. Using the same link that those of you who are watching live, you can watch the program as many times as you'd like. And so it will be posted on our YouTube page under live presentations in perpetuity. During the program, you'll be able to post questions to the comments box. After Vice Admiral Roegge has completed his presentation, we'll have a question and answer period. And at that time, I'll share your questions with him. In order to recite Vice Admiral Roegge's full biography, which is available in its entirety on the Continental Commandery website, we wouldn't have time to hear his presentation. So a very telescope version of that. He's currently president of Holtec Government Services, HGS, and is responsible for the division's business growth. He also serves as the senior vice president and chief strategy officer for HGS's corporate parent, Holtec International. Vice Admiral Roegge was a career submarine officer, nuclear propulsion engineer, and he led organizations of increasing size, budget, and complexity, ranging from command of a nuclear power submarine to command of the US Pacific Submarine Force. He culminated his career as president of the National Defense University. He's an honors graduate of the University of Minnesota with a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering, earned a master's degree in engineering management from the Catholic University of America, and a Master of Arts with highest distinction in national security and strategic studies from the Naval War College. With that, I want to welcome Vice Admiral Roegge. Welcome aboard. It's great to have you, sir. It was wonderful to hear you speak back at the Philadelphia Delaware Valley Commandery luncheon back in September. And I'm delighted to have been able to convince you to come and talk to us this evening. Before I talk more about your history, I know Homecoming 250 is coming up in about 18 months, but who's counting? You want to tell us a little bit about that and how people can get involved? I know we've got a slide on it later, but if we introduce it now, repetition is at the heart of education, isn't it?
Sure. Well, thanks, Fred. I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts, and certainly I hope to provide discussion worthy of repeated viewing on your YouTube channel, should anyone be so inclined. Fred mentioned a volunteer activity that I support, which is I serve on the board of the nonprofit group that is attempting to coordinate with the Navy and the Marine Corps for those services to celebrate their 250th anniversaries, their birthdays, in fall of next year here in the Delaware River Valley. So I'm speaking to you now from Philadelphia, the birthplace of the Navy and of the Marine Corps. So looking forward to the opportunity to welcome the services back to their birthplace for what we hope will be a pretty inspirational and rewarding series of events. There is my very last slide has a website link that people can follow for more information. But frankly, I think that the greatest opportunity to help, to support, to contribute is with your interest, with spreading the word. Certainly, if you're in this area, we're an all volunteer activity, and so there's many opportunities to contribute that way. And of course, if anybody's interested in contributing financially, then that also is certainly very much appreciated, so we can give the services the birthday celebration that they so richly deserve.
Terrific. And as a shameless plug, I will note that the Naval Orders 2025 Congress is scheduled to be held in Philadelphia during the week of 15 and 19 October. And so it is not a coincidence that our Congress will be taking place right in the middle of the primary events that are going on apropos of Homecoming 250. And we look forward to collaborating with the Homecoming 250 organization. I'm watching the clock and don't want to take up any more of your time on this chit chat. If we have time afterwards, we'll continue conversation. But at this point, I want to turn over the deck on the con so that you get maximum opportunity for your presentation.
Admiral, I relieve you, sir. And with that, I guess I'll just offer a little bit of context. So again, as Fred mentioned, my first career was as a submarine officer. All U.S. Navy submarines today are powered by nuclear reactors. So by design, by default, and having survived an interview with Admiral Rickover, I'm an engineer by academics and a naval nuclear engineer by training and experience. And then I retired from the Navy 3 years ago and promptly failed at retirement and took a job in the energy industry. And so my company, Holtec, is probably the largest clean energy company that most people have never heard of. But we are developing a new design of a nuclear reactor for power production to help meet America's clean energy goals. And we're in the process of doing something that has never been done before in the world, which is to take a commercial nuclear power plant, which has been retired for economic reasons in this case, and to restart it and return it to the grid producing clean energy. So again, my background as well as my passion was for energy. I managed to segue into a new career that gives me the opportunity to pursue that. And so my presentation today is an attempt to kind of leverage both of those experiences and both of those themes into what you see here on the title slide, which is talk a little bit about how our national security really is about our energy and, frankly, our economic security. And so, what you're seeing right here, and I promise I'm not going to read you all the words on all the slides. You can do that at your leisure or on your repeated viewing. But the most recent significant geopolitical event that I think has kind of reinforced this theme was, of course, the Russia invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago. And as you can see, in my bullets on the slide, there are a number of explicit results of that on energy prices and therefore with trickle-down effects on economies. What is interesting, though, is, and as you see in the upper right of this graph, the amount of gas that has gone to the European Union from Russia had been steady, then increasing, and then at the time after the invasion and due to sanctions and political decisions, that supply plummeted with a consequent increase in energy costs. And what is interesting, and what you kind of see on my bottom bullet, is that for a number of reasons that I'll talk about, and in a number of different dimensions, that impact on energy prices and on economies has had some profound impacts. One of which is that it certainly is causing nations to reconsider the security of their energy supplies, and is accelerating an energy transition, while at the same time posing some significant second and third order effects. And so in the bottom right, you can see just a blurb from Forbes about how Germany had begun a move towards clean energy and away, towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuel. They had shuttered many coal-fired plants as they were trying to build up more wind and more solar. And yet at the same time, they were decommissioning their nuclear power plants. And as a result, after the invasion and cutoff of Russian gas supplies, the German populace, the constituents, were kind of keen that when they flipped a light switch, the lights would actually come on. And so, Germany, although very committed to clean and green energy goals, is finding themselves having to go and restart coal-fired plants, and are actually planning on building more gas plants now because they want the lights to come on when the switch is flipped. And it's not just about residential consumers, but it's industry, and that's really the point of this slide. That a lot of German heavy manufacturing and industry, particularly things that are very energy intensive, such as steel and chemicals, a lot of those companies are retrenching significantly and shuttering plants, at least temporarily, due to high energy costs, which again was sort of an unintended consequence of the energy mix that they quite righteously were pursuing, but again, now responding to the shock of the war and its consequences, they're having to deal with. Let's see, and then it's not only that the impact is about the cost of energy and what that means for power production, but another one of those foreign policy and national security implications has really been kind of revealed here again, has to do with nuclear power, and in this case, the supply chain associated with nuclear power. So Ukraine is Europe's economy most dependent upon nuclear power for energy production. About 50% of their power comes from their nuclear power plants, and those supply chains, both for the fresh nuclear fuel, as well as for the disposal of and storage of the used fuel, those supply chains come from and return to Russia. And over the last decade, Ukraine, with a lot of support from the United States, has been attempting to wean themselves off of this dependence on Russia, because it was somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion a year going across the border to the Russian nuclear utility Rosatom, either for purchasing new fuel or for handling the used fuel. And this opinion piece from the Wall Street Journal is simply identifying that one of the unappreciative motives for the Russian invasion was the economic factors and the desire to try and prevent Ukraine from breaking away from that dependence on Russia. And then another aspect of this mix of energy security and national security, and more explicitly about foreign policy and influence, is highlighted in this piece, again from the Wall Street Journal, where we have seen how China has worked very actively in a number of strategic industries to try and corner the market, drive out competition. We've seen it in the production of solar cells, photovoltaic panels. We see it now beginning just at the leading edge on atomic power, where China, having borrowed liberally from an American Westinghouse power plant design, is now selling that overseas, and again, as a party-controlled entity, is able to try and inveigle potential customers, not just with the technology, but with very attractive financing kinds of options. And that becomes significant, not just in terms of the near-term transaction, the sale and the exchanges of currency that go along with it. But as you kind of see on this slide, particularly when you're talking about nuclear power, the transaction is really a century-long, the beginning of a century-long relationship. So as you can see on the slide here, it begins with even once the contract is signed, with the licensing and construction, and then 60 to 80 years or more of actually operating the plant, and again providing technical support, or as in the case of Russia and Ukraine, supplying fuel or handling the disposal, and then the decommissioning at the back end. So certainly nations see the opportunity to facilitate growth of nuclear industries as something which is not only an economic transaction, but a foreign policy one as well. And as I said, it really creates a century-long relationship. So let's then talk a little bit more about some of this competition for energy resources. So if again you accept my premise that energy security is naturally, intrinsically tied to national security, then where is that energy and how does one secure it? I just have a couple of examples here. Again, I won't. You needn't trouble yourself or strain your eyes trying to read all the details. What I just point out is on the left side there, a picture of the Eastern Mediterranean and the natural gas fields that have been discovered, under the seafloor, and all the spaghetti lines that go back and forth and cross each other are competing territorial claims. And again, as we see from current events, since October 7th in the Eastern Mediterranean, after the Hamas attack on Israel, this is not a quiet neighborhood. There are even without the competition for energy, there is a lot of competition for national security. So the competition for these resources is something that has tremendous potential to be a new or an additional source of conflict, and not only among nations that ostensibly are warring, but even NATO allies like Greece and Turkey have overlapping claims for some of these energy resources. And then the same argument applies to the graphic on the right-hand side. And again, it's a little hard to read, but that is looking down at the North Pole. And in gray are the countries surrounding the Arctic Ocean. And again, you can see by the different intensities of color, from purple to medium blue to light blue, those are all identified energy resources. And if it's purple, what the legend says is it's assessed there's a 100% chance that there's at least 50 million barrels of oil, or the equivalent to natural gas, available at that deposit. And again, although there are not necessarily competing territorial claims, the access to these resources is something that is a competition, because, of course, outside of 200 miles of an exclusive economic zone, nations cannot unilaterally lay claim to those resources. And the other thing that makes this particularly interesting and timely right now is there's a series of blue lines that show the average sea ice coverage in the Arctic. And you can see that the sea ice has been receding over the last 25 years, which means that those access to those resources becomes more attractive, and that now again increases the potential for competition, and competition has the potential to lead to conflict, and of course that would not be in anybody's interest. So I gave you some examples there of energy resources that are accessible only through the sea, and that brings me back to kind of the primary theme or organizing principle of the American approach to this issue, which is appreciating that the United States has always been a maritime nation. And again, you can see a number of bullets on the slide that testify to that, demonstrate it. Significant fractions of our international trade, of our GDP, et cetera, of our population, is coastal. But even historically, and I say again, we have always been a maritime nation. The Navy is enshrined in the Constitution. The Army is enshrined as well, but the Constitution reads that the Congress is responsible to maintain an army, or excuse me, to raise an army when required, but is required to maintain a navy. So I think there was a recognition that there would always be a continuing need for a navy, not necessarily for an army. And of course, as everybody knows, our Constitution says nothing about our brethren in the Marine Corps, the Air Force, or the Coast Guard. And then interesting as well, the quote at the bottom. So of course, George Washington, a great military leader as a general of the Continental Army. Little known fact, but George Washington was originally a midshipman in the Royal Navy and was slated for a career that perhaps would have led him to become an admiral in some navy, if not the Royal Navy, then the American Navy. But his mother begged with him tearfully, according to his biography, not to join the Navy because, of course, at that time, life on board a ship was something that was characterized by the English diarist Samuel Johnson, that being on a ship was like being in jail, but with the added risk of drowning. So obviously George's mom was not too excited about that prospect. He wound up doing okay in the Army. And then, some of those other considerations about, what is it that makes us a maritime nation, or why should we be a maritime nation? Why is it important to pay attention to the maritime? Well, obviously, you knew in fifth grade geography that the majority of the Earth is covered by water. And as I mentioned before, the majority of the world's population lives on coasts. So they certainly have an appreciation for the maritime, but also the ability to influence populations is affected from the maritime. 90% of global trade goes by sea, as again, you can see some of the major shipping routes and as well some of the significant choke points for maritime traffic. And even our internet traffic, even the majority of high data rate communication goes underwater through undersea cables. And it's your internet traffic, it's your stock market day trading, it's your ATM transactions. All of that goes underwater through the maritime. And as a result, when you think about cyberspace, it's easy to think about that as a realm which is in the atmosphere, but cyberspace is underwater effectively. And nations appreciate then that the ability to assure communication via these undersea cables relies upon awareness of the maritime domain and, if necessary, the ability to protect the maritime domain. So another recent example of this then goes to over the last several months, attacks by the rebel government of Yemen, the Houthis, missile attacks against merchant shipping traveling through the southern Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean through one of those checkpoints, the Bab el-Mandeb. And what you see here is what the impacts of those missile attacks has been on the insurance rates for shipping, and then on the fuel costs, not just for the cost of fuel, which now has to be redirected, but the greater shipping cost associated with ships that are not, whether they're carrying fuel or not, ships that now are having to avoid the Red Sea, avoid the Suez Canal, and travel around the Horn of Africa or go the other direction through the Indian Ocean. And interestingly, some of those critical undersea cables, go through the south, across the Red Sea, and across areas that can be accessed by the Houthis. And one of the things that they were threatening to do was to find and disrupt those undersea cables. And again, that's not necessarily a first world military power, but the ability to it doesn't take a lot to go into littoral regions in order to find something and be able to disrupt it. And then more recently, again, the other examples I was giving you were examples of interruption due to war and conflict. But that's not the only thing that has the ability to affect maritime trade. We know here on the East Coast, 6 weeks ago, a freighter lost power and ran into a bridge. Bridge collapsed and shut down the port of Baltimore. And although they're making heroic efforts now to get the full access back to the port, it has had an impact. And Baltimore doesn't necessarily get the same press or awareness, appreciation as a major shipping port as Norfolk or New York or Philadelphia. But as you can see here, there are some things where Baltimore is a preferred point of entry or point of departure. And again, those consequences are measurable. So then let's talk more then back on the topic of energy and what are the trends in energy and in our needs, and how are we going to meet those needs? And what you see here now is on the left, first of all, is a projection of a mapping across two indices here. So this is a standard of living as informed by electrification. So on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you have something which is known as the Human Development Index. So the higher you are on that, moving up that chart, the greater the standard of living. And going from left to right is the electrical consumption per capita. And so what you see is that a good place to be is at the top, and to be at the top, generally speaking, requires more electricity because we use electricity for everything, and that demand is continuing to grow. And as you see at the bottom, the projection, this is from the US Energy Information Agency, is that global electricity demand could increase by anywhere from a third to 3/4 over the next 25 years. And most of that is that additional generation is expected to come from renewables and from nuclear. But again, if we're not thoughtful about how we make that transition, in the interim, there's great potential that there's going to be a need for more gas and more fossil fuel to meet the energy requirements. And so, but it is energy security concerns that does drive some of this move towards renewables and towards nuclear. Fossil fuels have very specific geologic as well as geographic origins. Obviously Russia is richly blessed with fossil fuel resources, and so for decades it's been very convenient for Europe, which has few fossil resources, to import from Russia. But these security concerns, particularly now over the last couple of years, motivates them to try and look at renewables, because of course almost anywhere in the world you can build a windmill, you can plant a solar farm, and you can generate your own electricity and start to break some of that dependence on supply chains for fossil fuels if you're not blessed with fossil fuels yourself. In the middle there, again, just kind of showing what the carbon emission trends are and the carbon reduction goals. Obviously, it's not only energy security that is driving interest in clean energy, but it is concern over global warming, and certainly we can see the increasing frequency and intensity of some of our weather activity that certainly again indicates that something has changed in the world, and whether you're a believer or not in climate change, things are different and are getting more exciting in ways that are not necessarily good. So then, let's see. lost my cursor here. So then let's talk about some of these different energy sources. At the bottom here, you see some examples of some of the fossil fuel, carbon generating sources. And then moving up, you can see some renewables and all the way up to nuclear. And so from left to right, then, this is identifying some of the different dimensions by which to compare and contrast different sources of energy. Dark green is considered in this context a good thing. It's the legend labels it as a high value. The lighter green down to the gray less so. And so those, again, I won't read you the slide, but the dimensions being compared is is it a clean source? Does it generate carbon or not? Is it a firm source? That is it reliable 24/7, 365, or is it dependent on things that are kind of outside of human control, like when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing? Land use is a significant factor, particularly as populations grow. So the energy density, in other words, how many megawatts or terawatts of power can be produced per acre, becomes a pretty significant differentiator. And then, as well, it turns out that at least half the cost of new power production is not the power source itself, the solar farm or the nuclear power plant, but it's the transmission and distribution lines that have to run, in some cases, miles, tens of miles, scores of miles, hundreds of miles. And then, there's another category of economic benefits. I mean, how many jobs are created, and what else can the power be used for? And you see that kind of across the board, and maybe as a surprise to many of you, the thing that comes out kind of best is more nuclear. And again, I freely confess my bias that having spent 40 years driving nuclear-powered submarines and now operating in the commercial nuclear power industry, I mean, I'm a big proponent of more nuclear. That doesn't make me anti-renewables, but because I think we're going to have a need for everything. But I think we need to be more aggressive in trying to get more nuclear on the grid. But the only thing then that doesn't compete quite so favorably, you see in the far right-hand column, which is it cost competitive today? And for a number of reasons and we'll get into a little bit, it's not particularly cost competitive. Some of that is because some of that is because here in the U.S., over the last 10 to 20 years, particularly with fracking technologies, America has become a net exporter of energy. So the prices of gas, natural gas, et cetera, are more competitive than they used to be. And with some of the renewables, there's an awful lot of private equity investment and government incentives and subsidies that is kind of skewing the marketplace and encouraging building more renewables to an extent that nuclear has not yet been a recipient of. Although that has started to change over the last couple of years. Let's see. Then here's another useful way of trying to compare the different ways of trying to produce power, on top of all those other dimensions, I mean, the things that people typically focus on then these days, safety, of course, is a big one, and how clean, what are the greenhouse gas emissions? And I know that a lot of what is heard as concerns or resistance or reasons to not pursue more nuclear is concerns about safety. And that's certainly understandable. When there is an issue with the nuclear power plant, it gets a lot of attention. And nuclear is one of those things that's not necessarily well understood at a scientific or engineering level. And of course, things that are not well understood can be kind of scary. But this is a very interesting curve on the safety side, because this is looking at all the different, the mortality associated with each of these resources across its entire life cycle. So, for example, coal comes out with this lower safety rate, a higher death rate, based on the premature deaths that result from contamination, pollution in the atmosphere, and its effect on respiratory systems, lung cancers, things like that, as well as injuries, fatalities that occur in the mining of coal, the distribution, the transportation. So all of that entire life cycle of cradle to grave associated with the source of energy is what goes into this. And then what those numbers are purporting is, again, for a nominal hypothetical city of 150,000 people that uses 1 terawatt of power per year, then based on this statistical analysis, how many additional deaths above normal would be expected if the city was powered entirely by every one of these. So the way to read the graph is if the city's terawatt of power came all from coal, you'd expect out of those 150,000 persons population that there'd be 25 more deaths on average, so a higher mortality, and 18 and 3 and 4, etc. When you get down to wind and nuclear and solar, you're less than 1. So what you're really talking about there is that for wind, it's 1 additional death every 25 years. So again, by orders of magnitude, many smaller. And then similar kind of calculus on the right hand side for the greenhouse gas emissions. So again, I've already kind of shared my view that in order to decarbonize, it's going to require a mix of renewables and something which is more reliable, so such as nuclear. This is a comparison of 2 different ways of meeting a greater electrical capacity by the year 2050. So in both cases, the task is to try and generate the same amount of electricity. On the left-hand side, it's allowing for the construction of more nuclear power, proportionally more nuclear power. On the right-hand side, you're constraining, the growth of nuclear, so it's never more than what it is right now, which is about 13% in the United States. And what is interesting and sobering is that it's significantly more expensive if the majority of your energy growth is going to come from wind and solar, and that's because of the fact that a nuclear power plant is effectively generating power at 100% for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And wind is generating power when the wind is blowing in proportion to how fast the wind is blowing, and solar when the sun is shining in proportion to how much solar energy is radiated. And so to achieve the same aggregate output, you have to have a lot more wind and solar to compensate for the times when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining. So this is what I was just describing is referred to as capacity factor in the industry. So, and it's just as I tried to explain, if something is producing at 100% power, 24/7, 365, you'd have a 100% capacity factor. For a nuclear plant, occasionally every 18 to 24 months, the plant has to shut down in order to refuel. But you can see that that maintenance and refueling affects all of these systems to different degrees. And then when you get down to the bottom with wind and solar, you're again affected by how often is the wind blowing and at what speed, how often is the sun shining and at what intensity. I mentioned that another one of the dimensions of comparison had to do with land use or the energy density. And this becomes, again, particularly significant when you consider, well, what else would we want to be using that land for? Possibly we'll need it for agriculture, for growing the food to sustain our growing population. In some cases, there may be, geologic or geographic features that make it kind of impractical to be able to cobble together, 18,000 acres as in the example here. So nuclear has a very, very high energy density, which also means that the source of generation can be placed closer to the place that it's needed, whether it's the factory or the city. So those transmission and distribution investments and costs become much larger when you have to collect that power from windmills scattered over 18,000 acres, or photovoltaic panels scattered over 3,000 acres. So energy density becomes an issue. And I don't know whether anyone in our viewing audience is out west of the Mississippi. I would say there's a lot of wide open spaces out west of Mississippi, but people out west of the Mississippi kind of like their spaces to be wide open. So interestingly, a lot of the strongest resistance to deploying more wind or more solar is in the places where there ostensibly is plenty of land that could be used for that, because there are other things that people want to use the land for. So where do we stand then in terms of deploying nuclear around the world? This just kind of shows country by country where there are operational reactors. And the United States was a leader in this industry. We were the first ones to develop nuclear power for energy production through the U.S. Navy under Admiral Rickover, and then that turned into a commercial industry with now we have over 90 active nuclear power plants. Although that number is smaller now than it was 10 years ago. So we've shut down 13 nuclear power plants, again, largely due to economic reasons, because of this kind of skewed marketplace that I was describing earlier. China, on the other hand, is building reactors rapidly because they see that as an answer to their own energy requirements. And France has, 50 years ago, recognized that there would be value in freeing themselves from dependence on Russian fossil fuels, and so they've always had a large fraction of their domestic energy production coming from nuclear as well. And then again, this is some of the detail behind my last comment, which is that China is actively building 18 plants right now. You can see many places around the world with active construction projects. The U.S. actually just completed construction on its two. Currently, America has none that are under construction. But it's a pretty exciting time in the domestic nuclear industry because there are many companies now that are developing new designs and a different approach to nuclear power production through something called a category of reactors called small modular reactors. And my company, Holtec, is one of those developers. So we're in the process of designing and licensing our plants, and plan to build our first ones at this same site in Michigan, where we're in the process of restarting a shuttered nuclear power plant. So again, a pretty exciting time for nuclear power. And then this on the left, again, you can kind of see that there's a spectrum of sizes and approaches. So I mentioned small modular reactors. So that's considered everything from about 100 to 300 megawatts of production. And then there's smaller ones that are mini reactors. There's micro reactors. The output of a reactor can be the output of a reactor is heat, and that heat can be used to turn a turbine to generate electricity. That electricity can be used to electrolyze water molecules into hydrogen, or that heat can be used on its own merits in industrial processes, steam manufacturing, chemical manufacturing, et cetera. And some of these coming opportunities for the next generation of nuclear, it really goes now beyond the traditional model of an electrical utility deciding to build a power plant. With this new generation of smaller reactors, it's possible to and becomes economically viable for a commercial entity, an industrial user, to fund the development of of a reactor, so they can assure their own access to that reliable and secure power. Dow Chemical recently signed an agreement with a modular reactor developer down in Texas to have that reactor's output heat used to drive Dow chemical processes. So again, whether it's steel producers, chemical producers, and of course information users, cyber users, data users. So server farms, there's incredible growth in the electrical requirements for data centers, driven by the computing requirements of artificial intelligence, crypto mining, cloud computing. All these things are a tremendous new demand on global electrical power supply. Slide here talks about it could potentially grow to 3 to 4% of global demand by 2030. Even in the U.S., it's estimated that from 2023 to 2027, the electrical consumption by data centers could go from 4% to 6%, so almost double U.S. electrical power generation. So the need for more electrical generation is growing, and it's growing quickly. And that brings me back to where we started, which is that we are and have always been, and likely will always be, a maritime nation. For not only because it's enshrined in our history, but because it is through the freedom of the seas, which is protected by our sea services, that we ensure our economic security and our energy security, which is what we need for our national security. And then my getting off the stage slide is this kind of wrap up of, again, where we started with this volunteer activity, Homecoming 250, Navy and Marine Corps. The website is listed at the bottom. The Navy, both the Continental Navy and the United States Navy had their origins in one in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the other in Constitution Hall. The Marine Corps had their first enlistment drive at a place called Tun Tavern in Old City, Philadelphia. Tun Tavern didn't live to reach the 19th century, but its original location is now underneath I-95. But there's a nonprofit that has just purchased a site about 200 yards away from the original one, and by the time of the Marine Corps birthday next year, they hope to have an operating Tun Tavern reconstruction in Philadelphia by which to celebrate. And interestingly, the very first Marine Corps ball was held in Philadelphia at the Belvedere Ballroom in 1925. So in 2025, looking forward to helping the Corps celebrate their 100th birthday. Okay, and that concludes my slides. And Fred, I'm happy to take questions for however much time we have.
Excellent. That's a fascinating, again, many of our listeners fully appreciate that we're a maritime nation. What we find frustrating, especially our good fellow citizens in the heartland, they have difficulty imagining that we're truly a maritime nation and we're utterly dependent upon our access to sea lanes. When it comes to the nuclear, one, I've got to do a full disclosure. I have an interest in the nuclear industry in that I am the microbiology subject matter expert for the diesel fuel oil group, the folks that are responsible for the emergency generators at all of our nuclear power facilities. So it's a topic that's fairly near and dear. Hopefully we never need to use those generators, but if the filters are plugged and the fuel doesn't get to the generators, then we have challenges. As you're talking, and I was thinking about it, but one of our listeners has posted a question. We look at the destruction of Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and that is a significant strategic hit, I would think. how many people have died as a result of production of electricity by nuclear power? You know, we think of Chernobyl, and in terms of other incidents, and was it Fujiyama that, of course, that was the tidal wave. But in terms of from incidents at nuclear power facilities,
Yeah. Well, the again, I don't. I showed you that slide earlier that had that data all normalized. So I don't know what the raw numbers are behind that, but I
right,
do know that is generally assessed in the professional literature that as a result of 3 Mile Island, there were no deaths, no additional deaths. As a result of Chernobyl, it's assessed there were probably about 400 additional deaths. And as a result of Fukushima, there was approximately about 2,000 additional deaths. And of course, you can compare that with, China had the the hydropower data is affected by the Chinese dam that burst and killed 170,000 people. The Bhopal chemical industrial accident was, I believe, tens of thousands of people. So again, I'm not picking on those. I mean, those are all extreme examples, but those are the kinds of things that go into the statistics.
right. It's similar to, an aircraft falls out of the sky and it gets a lot of press, and people go into. I often talk about risk assessment and wind up the discussion by saying, despite all the objective data, the outrage factor trumps everything else. And I think with nuclear power, you've got these images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that permeate the collective consciousness. And even though how many nuclear reactor failures have there actually been in what we're talking 60 years of or 70 years of nuclear power? Would have there been half a dozen incidents?
Well, it depends on what you consider an incident, but I mean, the three things that are in the popular consciousness are the ones that I just mentioned.
Right.
And certainly, we can look at our Navy again, I think, as being kind of a standard bearer and standard setter here. It's millions and millions of miles steamed on nuclear power without any significant environmental or human impact. And I think maybe I'll say one more thing in response to the question that was posted. It may, in part, oftentimes one of the questions, is really about trying to understand, what health hazard, what risk results from radiation, and it is in the nature of a nuclear reaction that there is radiation. Reactors are designed with shielding in order to make sure that those levels are safe. And for perspective, it's important for everybody to keep in mind that our world is inundated by radiation from natural sources every day. It comes from the sun and from the cosmos. It comes from granite in the ground, and of course, in our modern society, who here has not had an X-ray from the dentist, from the doctor, etc. So there is less exposure that I received in my years of submarining than you would could accumulate by being an airline pilot and flying at 30,000 feet for your career.
Right. Now, one of the things, as you're talking, I'm flashing back to a campfire conversation I had with. I was scoutmaster while I was in graduate school, and one of my assistant scoutmasters was a professor of mechanical engineering, and also a fellow damage control assistant. And I was asking him why there are more issues and more concerns for civilian plants than there were Navy. And he explained that the quality assurance on reactor shells in the Navy, at least it was in the Rickower Navy, was substantially more robust than in the civilian sector, where if one were to x-ray the weld seams, you'd let the seams coalesce for, let's say, a day or two before you'd x-ray them. whereas on a civilian, you may still be welding at one end of the reactor shell, and they're already X-raying the weld at the other end. Has that changed in the past, let's say, decade?
Well, I've only been part of the commercial nuclear power industry for about 3 years right now, but certainly I can assure you that what I see is that the standards that are applied to nuclear project construction on the commercial side is every bit as good as it is in the Navy, and it needs to be. And again, and we're fortunate to have regulatory bodies with the responsibility to make sure that not just taking the manufacturer's word for it.
That's terrific, and that probably reflects an evolution not only in reactor design, but the seriousness of quality assurance. And my experience is that there's a significant percentage of folks who work at nuclear power plants who gain their training same place you did.
Mm-hmm.
That
yep, very true.
Come off active duty, and it's a great segue from active duty as a nuclear engineer on submarines or let's see, do we still have any active surface ships? Long Beach still steaming? No,
just the aircraft carriers.
Just the aircraft carriers. So we've got the carriers and we have the submarines, and if people leave active duty, there are a lot of reservists who are working at nuclear power facilities. My experience.
Yep, and we're better for them.
Absolutely, and they come with a lot of experience, and my experience at doing inspections and fuel quality work at nuclear power facilities is you don't find a group of more professional people in many other sectors.
Mm-hmm.
It's really terrific. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour, and we could talk about this probably for many hours to come, but we won't. Again, I want to thank you for a great presentation, and want to just put in a plug for next month where Captain Michael Lilly will be covering a lot of the material he has in his book, Nimitz at Rest. So Michael Lilly's parents were close friends with Admiral Nimitz, and so he has a lot of direct family lore and experience. Michael is also a past Attorney General of the state of Hawaii, and so he's got Hawaii in his blood. He presented about a half a year ago on who really discovered those islands we now call Hawaii, which were originally called the Sandwich Islands. And I believe the Spanish had another name for them even before they were called the Sandwich Islands. But he gave a great presentation making a strong case that Captain Cook did not discover them. And he used charts that were created by the Spanish. So he was the first British officer to sail and visit Hawaii. And with that, I want to thank everybody who's joined us this evening, and appreciate all the questions. Oh, we have time maybe to capture whatever happened to the SS Savannah.
It is in Baltimore. It has been decommissioned, and there is, I think, an ongoing project to dismantle and dispose of its nuclear components.
Is she likely to become a museum or a hotel? Any idea what's going on
I
here?
hear about that. So, the Savannah was actually built at the New York Shipbuilding Company in Camden, New Jersey.
Right, just across the river from where I'm sitting right now.
Okay, and it actually, the original site of the New York Shipbuilding Company is the site that my company Holtec now occupies, which is the reason I'm well versed now on the Savannah. But yeah, the Savannah was built there at the in Camden, and had a short commercial life before again it became economically non-viable, and I think has been mothballs for a while.
Very good. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and in respect of those who've spent the last hour with us, I want to thank you and thank them. And again, terrific presentation. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.